Good evening, she said quietly. My name is Maria. I am the daughter he never told you about. We stood there, frozen, staring at this stranger in our father's house. A stranger with his eyes, his chin, his quiet, steady way of standing. My father had been dead for 3 weeks. But his biggest secret was still alive. And she was standing in our living room. Just minutes before, I had read his letter aloud. She was born first, it said. Before any of you. She is my first daughter. And she is alive. We thought we had come home for Christmas to bury the past. Instead, the past was waiting for us at the door. This is the story of the Christmas that changed everything. The lights were on when our taxi pulled up to the old family compound. Every single window glowed softly in the evening darkness. I leaned forward in my seat. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. The lights are on, I said quietly. My younger brother Daniel shifted beside me. His jaw was already set in that tense way I had learned to recognize over the years. Maybe the caretaker forgot to switch them off, he muttered. But even he did not sound convinced. On the other side of the car, my older sister Grace clutched her handbag like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She had not been back to this house in 10 years. She had sworn she never would return. But Papa's death 3 weeks ago had changed everything. Our mother sat quietly in the front seat. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her hair had turned almost completely gray this past year. The lines around her mouth had deepened. She said nothing as the taxi stopped and we all climbed out slowly. The driver left us standing there at the rusty gate. We stared at the house that should have been dark and empty. But it was not. The compound gate groaned as we pushed it open together. It made the same sound it had always made. The compound looked exactly as I remembered. Old flower pots with cracks running through them. Veranda chairs sitting in their familiar places. A pair of sandals lying near the door, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. Who is here? Grace whispered. No one answered her. Daniel reached for the door handle. Then he stopped. He turned to Mama. Mama, do you have the key? She blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. Then she opened her handbag with shaking hands. I watched her fingers tremble as she took out the familiar metal key ring. She unlocked the door. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door swung open. A familiar smell drifted out. Dust. Old wood. And something that made my chest ache. Papa's shaving soap. The faint scent of engine oil from his work clothes. We stepped inside together. The living room was clean. Too clean. I stopped in the doorway, taking it all in slowly. The curtains were open. The sofa cushions were arranged neatly. The family photographs on the wall had been wiped free of dust. On the center table sat a vase of fresh flowers. And beside it, a lit candle. Who has been here? Daniel said. His voice was low and dangerous. I asked the caretaker to come once a week, Mama replied. But there was uncertainty in her voice. To sweep. To check the windows. I did not tell him to light candles. I moved closer to the candle. My breath caught in my throat. There was something under the glass vase. A folded note. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. What is it? Grace asked. I looked at the front of the note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Papa's handwriting. There is a name on it, I said quietly. It says, for my children. We all turned to look at Mama at the same time. Her face went pale. She sank slowly into the nearest chair, as if her legs could no longer hold her weight. Read it, she whispered. I unfolded the paper carefully. My hands would not stop shaking. I took a deep breath and began to read aloud. My dear children. If you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to say everything I needed to say while I was alive. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the old wall clock. Tick. 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 I continued reading. I know you are angry with me. Some of you more than others. I know you have questions about the way I treated your mother. About the decisions I made. I cannot change the past. But there is something I must tell you. Something you must know before you decide what to do with this house and everything I leave behind. My throat felt tight. I paused for a moment, trying to steady my voice. There is a truth I have hidden from all of you for more than 30 years, I read on. This truth will hurt you. It may even make you hate me. But you deserve to know who you are, and why our family became what it is. Grace cleared her throat. Anna, she said softly. Maybe we should read this later. It is late. We are all tired. But Daniel stepped closer. His hands were clenched into fists. No, he said firmly. We read it now. I swallowed hard. And I kept reading. First, I read slowly. I must ask your forgiveness. Especially yours, Elena. Mama let out a small sound. Almost like a sob. She pressed a hand against her chest. My voice shook as I continued. I married your mother when I was a younger man than you can imagine. I was proud. I was stubborn. And I was poor. Your mother came from a family that did not approve of me. They said I was not good enough. I said I would prove them wrong. In the process, I hurt the person who loved me most. Daniel began pacing slowly. Grace stared at the floor. I could barely breathe. When your mother and I could not have children in the first years of our marriage, I panicked. I listened to voices that did not care about our home. People who told me that a man without a child is not a man at all. I began to think your mother was the problem. I allowed bitterness to enter our home. I stopped. I looked at Mama. Tears were running down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. I forced myself to continue. I did something unforgivable, the letter said. I went to another woman. I thought it would be a secret. I told myself it was only once. But that one night changed everything. The room felt colder now. As if someone had opened all the windows. My hands shook so much the paper rustled loudly in the silence. Several months later, I found out that this woman was expecting a child. I was terrified. I knew if your mother learned about it, it would break her heart. I also knew I could not abandon an innocent child. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. Before that child was born, your mother came to me. She told me she was expecting. The joy I felt that day was mixed with shame. I did not deserve that happiness. Yet, your mother smiled and said, God has remembered us. I did not tell her that I had already made a terrible mistake. Grace covered her mouth with her hand. Her chest rose and fell quickly. I read more slowly now. Dreading every word. I tried to manage both lives in secret, the letter continued. Your mother's pregnancy. The other woman's pregnancy. I told myself I would find a way to fix it later. But life does not wait for us to become wise. There was a paragraph where the ink looked darker. As if Papa had pressed the pen harder. When you, my first child with Elena, were born, I was at the hospital. I held you in my arms. I promised I would be a better man. I told myself I would end the other situation. But by then, it was too late. The other child had also been born. A girl. I felt Daniel and Grace staring at me. My voice dropped to barely a whisper. She was born first. Before any of us. She is my first daughter. She has my name on her birth papers. And she is alive. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Grace stepped backward. As if someone had struck her. What is this? She whispered. Papa had another child? A daughter? Before us? Daniel's face darkened with anger. Where is she? He demanded. Where has she been all this time? I forced myself to keep reading, though my voice was barely audible now. She has known about all of you for many years, I read. She has watched this family from a distance. I failed you by hiding her. I failed her by not giving her the place she deserved. My voice fell to a whisper as I read the final lines. This Christmas, I want all my children under one roof. By the time you read this, she will already be there. I know you may not forgive me, but I pray you will at least see each other. Listen. And then decide what kind of family you want to be. The letter ended there. No signature. No explanation. For a moment, none of us moved. None of us spoke. Then, from the hallway, I heard it. A soft sound. A floorboard creaking. All four of us turned toward the sound at the same time. My breath stopped. A woman was standing there, just beyond the doorway. She was in her early 40s. She had calm eyes, and a face that seemed strangely familiar. There was something of Papa in her features. Around the mouth. Around the chin. A certain steady way she held herself. Good evening, she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. My name is Maria. I am the daughter he never told you about. The silence that followed was so heavy I felt like I was drowning in it. Grace stepped backward. Daniel's hands balled into fists. I stood frozen. The letter pressed against my chest. Mama's face was wet with tears. But she did not move. I have been here since morning, Maria continued. Her eyes were lowered. The caretaker let me in when I showed him the lawyer's letter. I tried to prepare the house. I wanted it to feel like home for you. Even though it is not my home yet. Or maybe it will never be. She swallowed. Then she looked at Mama. I am sorry, she said. Mama closed her eyes. One hand went to the armrest of the chair. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Leave, Daniel said suddenly. His voice was harsh. You cannot just stand there and say good evening like this is normal. This is our house. Our father's house. Who told you you could come here? The will, Maria replied softly. He left instructions with his lawyer. He wanted us all here. Together. For Christmas. It is not Christmas yet, Grace snapped. Go to a hotel. Or go back to wherever you came from. I watched Maria's face closely. She was calm. But her eyes shone with unshed tears. I understand your anger, she said. If I were in your place, I would feel the same. You do not understand anything, Daniel cut in. You are part of what destroyed our family. That is enough. Mama's voice was low. But firm. We all turned to look at her. She slowly got to her feet. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. We will not shout in this house, she said quietly. Not tonight. Mama, Daniel protested. Mama raised a hand. Your father chose to betray our marriage, she said. Not this woman. Not this child. She did not ask to be born. Her words hung in the air. Steady and clear. Maria's shoulders shook slightly. She turned her face away for a moment. Gathering herself. I did not come here to take anything from you, Maria said. Her voice was soft but steady. I came because he asked me to. And because I wanted to see the family I have watched from far away. I frowned. From far away? I asked. Maria nodded slowly. I grew up not very far from here, she said. I saw him sometimes in town. With all of you. At first, my mother told me he was just a kind man who helped us with money. But as I grew older, I saw the way he looked at you. At your mother. I felt the distance. I knew there was a story I did not know. Your mother knew about us? Grace asked. Shock filled her voice. Yes, Maria said. She knew he had a family. She always believed one day he would tell you about me. That he would find a way to bring us together. She kept hoping. Even when it became clear he was not ready. She never asked him to leave you. She looked around at the room. Then at Mama. Meanwhile, your mother carried the pain of not knowing, Maria added softly. I have thought about you for years, madam. I did not hate you. I envied you. And I pitied you at the same time. Mama's shoulders drooped. She let out a long, slow breath. I do not know you, Mama said. But I know what it is to be a woman who waits for a man to make things right. And I know what it is to be left with the consequences of his choices. They stared at each other for a long moment. Two women. Joined by the same betrayal. Standing on different sides of it. I realized then that I had been holding my breath. Later that night, I found myself in the kitchen. I was rinsing old plates in the sink. Maria quietly appeared beside me. She began washing spoons and cups. We worked in silence for a long time. Finally, I asked the question I had been holding back. Did you ever meet him? I said. Properly, I mean. As a father? Yes, Maria answered. She paused. And no. I waited. He came to see my mother sometimes, she said. He paid my school fees. He asked about my grades. He brought me books. Birthdays, sometimes. But he never stayed long. He always looked like he needed to be somewhere else. Here, I murmured. Yes, she said. Here. I scrubbed a plate harder than necessary. Did you resent us? I asked. Maria dried a plate slowly. Thinking. When I was a teenager, yes, she admitted. I wondered why you got his name. His time. His public love. I had to hide mine. But when I got older, and I saw how he spoke to your mother in the market one day, I realized you were also paying a price. Just a different one. I looked at her sharply. How did he speak to her? He snapped at her, Maria said. She asked him about money for something. And he talked to her like she was a burden. I remember thinking, he treats the woman he lives with like this. No wonder he cannot stand properly for my mother either. That was the day I stopped thinking one of you had the better life. I stared at the plate in my hands for a long time. Seeing my father in a way I had never allowed myself to see him before. From the living room that same night, I could hear Daniel's voice. Tense and stubborn. She cannot stay here, Mama. We will not be able to breathe. She is already here, Mama replied gently. And it is only for a few days. Grace's voice cut in. Sharp with emotion. A few days? Do you plan to have Christmas with her as if we have known her all our lives? I did not say that, Mama answered. But I will not drag any woman out of this house in the dark because of your father's sin. I have dealt with enough shame in my life. I heard the surprise and the silence that followed. We were all seeing Mama in a new way. You children think this is the worst pain you have seen, Mama continued. You forget that I have lived with half-truths for decades. I suspected something long ago. But he would look me in the eye and say, you are my only wife. These are my only children. He chose his lie. Now we must choose our truth. A few evenings later, I walked past Mama's bedroom. I saw Grace sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. I lingered in the hallway. Not wanting to intrude. But unable to walk away. Mama, Grace said quietly. How are you, really? Mama took a long time to answer. I am tired, she said finally. But I am also relieved. Relieved? Grace repeated. Surprise filled her voice. Yes, Mama said. For years, I felt something was wrong. But I did not know what. I thought maybe it was my fault. Maybe if I were more loving. More patient. More beautiful. Your father would be truly present with us. Now I see that his absence began long before I married him. It was never about me. Grace's voice was small. Do you hate him? Mama thought for a moment. I am angry, she said. I am hurt. But hate? No. Hate would mean he still controls my heart. He does not. Not anymore. Grace looked at her lap. What about her? Maria? Mama said. I do not hate her either. I see her mother in her. A woman I never knew. Whose life was also shaped by decisions she did not make. She turned to Grace. You think your father betrayed only me. But he also betrayed his own heart. He never made a full choice. And so he left everyone half satisfied. Half broken. I quietly moved away from the door. Mama's words echoing in my mind. The next day, the lawyer arrived. He came with his heavy briefcase and tired eyes. We gathered around the dining table. Mama sat at the head, as she always had. Daniel, Grace, and I took one side. Maria sat alone on the other. The lawyer cleared his throat. He unfolded some papers. Your father's will, he began, is simple in some areas. And complicated in others. Start with the simple part, Daniel said. He was trying to sound in control. The small factory in town is to be sold, the lawyer said. The money is to be divided into 4 equal parts. 1 share for each of his children. Including Maria. I felt Grace flinch beside me. Daniel's jaw tightened. I could not look up from the table. What about the house? Mama asked quietly. The house is to remain in your name, madam, the lawyer replied. Your husband has written that you may live here for as long as you choose. When you pass, the house will then be shared equally among all the children. All eyes went to Maria. She stared at her hands. However, the lawyer continued, there is one more matter. Your father left a separate letter. Meant only for his wife and for Maria. He requested that it be read in your presence, madam. But it is addressed to the 2 of you specifically. He said it concerns the early years of his mistake. My chest tightened. What kind of concern? I asked. The lawyer hesitated. Then he opened a second envelope. His voice grew softer as he read. Elena, if you are hearing this, then the truth has already begun to show itself. There is something else I must confess. It may bring you some comfort. Or it may bring you more pain. I do not know. He paused. He looked at Mama. She nodded for him to continue. Maria, you need to know that you were not the result of a simple, thoughtless betrayal. What happened between your mother and me was wrong. But it did not begin the way I allowed others to believe. The room grew completely still. I could hear my own heartbeat. When my family forced me to marry Elena quickly, I was already in love with another woman. Your mother, Maria. We had been together quietly for almost a year. We wanted to marry. But my parents refused. They said she was not from the right background. They promised me land and help with a factory if I married Elena instead. I watched Mama's eyes fill with tears. She held the edge of the table. But did not speak. The lawyer continued. I was a coward. I allowed myself to be bought. I married Elena, even though my heart was still with your mother. When she found out, she was broken. We were both young. We made foolish choices. That is when you were conceived, Maria. You were conceived in love that had turned into confusion. Anger. And sorrow. His voice was gentle now. I told myself that I would still do my duty as a husband. But my heart was divided. Over time, I came to love Elena in my own way. She stood by me. She forgave more than I deserved. But I never had the courage to tell her that when we married, I was already tied to another woman. There was a long, painful silence. Grace spoke first. Her voice was slow and uncertain. So Papa did not just go out and cheat because Mama could not have children. He had something going on before? Yes, the lawyer said softly. That is what he is saying. Daniel's voice was hard with anger. And his parents knew? The lawyer nodded. It appears so. He writes here that his parents pressured him to leave the first woman for the better marriage. They believed they were securing the family's future. They did not know she was pregnant at the time. Mama closed her eyes. As if struck by a wave she had not seen coming. I was his second choice, she whispered. No, Maria said suddenly. Her voice was breaking. We were both his victims. All eyes turned to her. My mother spent years waiting for him, Maria said. She told me that he promised to come back when he had settled things with his family. He never did. He just visited sometimes. Bringing gifts. Saying, it is complicated. She grew old waiting for a man who had already built another life. She looked at Mama. Her eyes full of sympathy and pain. You married a man whose heart was divided, Maria said. My mother loved a man who never fully chose her. Neither of us got what we deserved. The truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. Everything I thought I knew about my parents' marriage shifted. This was not just a simple story of betrayal. This was something deeper. More complicated. More painful than any of us had imagined. Late one evening, I was passing through the hallway. I heard voices in the kitchen. I recognized Daniel's voice. And Maria's. I stopped. Listening. How did you feel when you found out about us? Daniel asked. Maria sighed. At first, I felt like someone had put a mirror in front of me. I saw all the things I did not have. A complete home. A father at the dinner table. Siblings who knew my name. She paused. But then I saw something else. I saw a woman in the market. Your mother. Standing alone while he walked ahead of her. I saw your father's tired face when he thought no one was looking. I saw the weight of his secrets. And I realized that even a house that looks strong from the outside can be full of cracks on the inside. There was a long silence. I am angry, Daniel said slowly. Not just at him. At you too. Even though I know it is not fair. I know, Maria said. If I were you, I would be angry at me as well. I represent everything you wish had not happened. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. You spent your whole life thinking you know your story. Then one letter changes everything. I spent my whole life wondering if I mattered to him, Maria said softly. Now he has given me a place in his will. But not in his life. It is its own kind of pain. Another silence. If it were up to you, Daniel asked, would you take your share of the inheritance and walk away? Or would you stay connected to us somehow? I held my breath. Waiting for her answer. I do not want to break what little is left of your family, Maria said quietly. If my presence here will destroy you, I can sign away my part. I have lived without his name all my life. I can live without his property. Why would you do that? Daniel asked. Surprise filled his voice. Because I know what it is like to grow up with less, Maria said. It is hard. But growing up with a house full of bitterness? That is harder. I stepped back from the doorway. My chest tight with emotion. Christmas Eve arrived. With the smell of cooking. And the soft glow of evening light. Despite everything, we set the dining table carefully. We sat together. Mama at the head. Me beside her. Daniel across from us. Grace at the far end. And Maria filling the last empty place. There was a heavy silence before anyone spoke. Maria broke it. I have something to say, she began. Her voice was steady but soft. She looked at the sheet of paper in front of her. I asked the lawyer to prepare this. It is a statement that I am willing to release my claim to part of the inheritance. Grace's head snapped up. What? I do not want to be the reason you fight, Maria said. You already have enough wounds. If my share of the money will tear you apart, I will not take it. I stared at her. Shocked. Daniel looked stunned. Mama watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. But why? I asked. It is your right. He wronged you too. He left you outside his life for years. Yes, Maria said simply. But I have survived without him. I have work. I have my own small home. I did not come here to collect the price of his guilt. I came because I wanted the truth. And I wanted to meet you. Her eyes filled with tears. Money cannot fix the years I did not have a father. It cannot pay for your mother's tears. It will only sit between us, reminding us of what we lost. I do not want that. She slid the paper toward the middle of the table. All eyes turned to Mama. Mama looked at the paper. Then at Maria. Then at each of us in turn. This is not just about money, she said quietly. It is about what kind of people we decide to be. She took a deep breath. I have lost many things in this marriage. But I will not lose my soul. Your father did not tell me the truth when he had the chance. He chose comfort over courage. I will not do the same. She looked at Maria. You are his daughter. Nothing can change that. If I push you away now, I become like the people who pushed you and your mother away many years ago. I cannot do that to another woman. Not now. Not after everything I know. She turned to us. If you take more because she takes less, you will always wonder if you earned it honestly. And every time you look at what you have, you will see her face. She reached out and gently pushed the paper back toward Maria. Keep your share. Take what the law and his words have given you. Your father should have given you more of himself. The least we can do is honor what little he finally tried to do right. Maria's lips trembled. Are you sure? Yes, Mama said. I am sure. There was a long pause. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was low. If Mama says you keep it, you keep it. But I want something in return. Maria looked at him. Afraid. I want you to come back next year, he said. Not for the inheritance. For Christmas. If we are going to accept you as our sister, then we must do it properly. Slowly. But properly. Grace let out a shaky laugh. You are inviting another argument. But there was something lighter in her voice. Maybe next Christmas will not feel like a funeral, I said softly. I wiped my eyes. Maybe it will feel new. Maria looked from one face to the other. I saw her see what I was seeing. Pain. Confusion. Hesitation. But also something fragile and rare. A small, real chance. I will come, she said softly. If you still want me then. Mama reached out. And placed her hand over Maria's for the first time. Eat, she said gently. The food will grow cold. We bowed our heads for a simple prayer. No big speeches. No dramatic tears. Just quiet words of thanks for the food. For the day. And for the strength to face tomorrow. Outside, a neighbor's children began to sing a Christmas song. Inside, our family began to pass plates. Hands reached across the table. Careful at first. Then more natural. On the morning Maria was to leave, I found her standing in the living room. She was looking at the wall of family photographs. Her face was not there in any of them. Maybe one day, I said from behind her, we will add a new photo. All of us. Together. Not because our father forced it. Because we chose it. Maria smiled. A little sadly. I would like that, she said. I watched Daniel load Maria's small suitcase into the waiting car. Grace handed her a food container for the road. She said it in a half-teasing, half-shy tone. That felt almost like sisterly care. At the gate, Mama hugged her. It was not a long embrace. But it was real. I cannot change how things began, Mama said. But I can decide how they continue. Travel safely. Thank you, Maria whispered. For not sending me away. As the car pulled out of the compound, I stood beside my mother and siblings, watching until it disappeared from view. The old house stood behind us, quiet and thoughtful. It had witnessed raised voices, broken promises, and silent tears. Now, it also carried the memory of something gentler. A group of people who had been given every reason to close their hearts, choosing instead to leave the door slightly open. In the months that followed, life moved on. Mama began to sit outside more often in the evenings, sipping tea, watching the sunset. I noticed that she walked with her head a little higher. She was still a widow. Still a woman who had known deep disappointment. But she was also something else now. A woman who had faced the truth and refused to let it make her cruel. I returned to my life more aware of how fragile family stories can be. I called Mama more often. I learned to listen more carefully when people spoke of their pasts. Hearing not just what they said, but what they could not say. Daniel worked harder at his job, determined to build a future that did not depend on old money or old lies. Grace, who had stayed away from the family home for so long, found herself visiting more. She helped Mama reorganize old things. Not to erase the past, but to make space for the future. And Maria went back to her life, carrying a new weight and a new lightness at the same time. She had a share in something she had never expected. Not just property, but siblings. Imperfect, cautious, wounded siblings, who had still chosen, in their own slow way, not to shut her out. On the next Christmas morning, a photo frame arrived at the old house by courier. I was there when Mama opened it. Inside was a picture taken on Maria's last day of that first visit. It showed all of us standing outside the house. Not quite touching, but not far apart either. There was a small note with it. Mama read it softly. Every story has a beginning we did not choose, but we can choose how it continues. She did not frame the sentence on a wall. She did not read it aloud as a lesson. She did not need to. It lived quietly in the way she picked up the phone when it rang and said, "Hello, Maria." It lived in the way Daniel sent a message asking, "Will you be around this December?" It lived in the way Grace found herself defending Maria in front of a stranger who called her an outsider. And in the way I sometimes sat with Mama and simply held her hand, without needing to fix anything. We had come home for Christmas expecting to collect what a dead man left behind. Instead, the truth had been waiting for us. Sharp, painful, and impossible to ignore. In choosing not to let that truth divide us completely, we discovered something our father had not fully understood. Love cannot erase betrayal. It cannot rewrite the past. But it can decide, quietly and firmly, what will be passed on to the next generation. A story of bitterness. Or a story of hard, honest healing. We did not become a perfect family. No family is. But we became a family that knew how dangerous secrets can be. How costly silence is. And how powerful it is when one person, especially a woman who has known deep hurt, chooses to respond with dignity instead of revenge. And in that old house, under that same roof, the echoes of past betrayals slowly began to fade, replaced by something softer. A new kind of truth that did not shout, but stayed.